So our next guest is going to take us down another road. Mr. Robert Stohr is the Executive Director for U.S. Vets and oversees programs and operations at U.S. Vets at Patriotic Hall in downtown L.A. He works on a variety of different programs. Today he's going to talk to us about recovery from loss, grief and loss. He's going to talk to us about how, as a psychotherapist, he has helped develop programming to support people who need special services and are overcoming tremendous losses. He's got quite a resume, and I'll let him tell you what he wants about it, but I assure you it's pretty impressive. But please put your hands together for a warm welcome to Mr. Robert Stohr.
Thank you, Luke. And thank you for being here. I do a lot of speaking on suicide prevention. It's a very important topic to me, and I'm always impressed when I come and find out that people are gathering, because you're doing exactly what we need to figure out how to survive this crazy epidemic that some of you have experienced. I am a suicide loss survivor, so I'm going to take you down a journey about how I got there, and I'm also going to take you through a journey of how I got through what happened after that happened. I know anytime I speak that there are 30 to 40% of you that also may be loss survivors. Those are the statistics. And so I want to be very conscious, and I know some of you will feel some of what I feel. And I also want to let you know that after the death of my partner of 15 years, I went to work for the Suicide Prevention Center. I became the director of that center, and I also worked with attempt survivors as well as loss survivors. So I'm well aware that there are those of you in the room as well that have what we call lived experience. You've got the experience of having had to deal or fight with dealing with suicidal ideation and urges. So I want to thank you all for the courage to be here today. And you know, it's really interesting to go after Jeff. I thought, well, maybe I want to be as smart as Dr. Casey, and I don't know if I can get as loud as Jeff, though. I thought they're going to go to sleep when I get up there, but it's a good thing I talked to my 90-year-old mother before I got here, and she said, I said, I'm presenting, she said, is it important? I said, of course it's an important presentation. She goes, well, just remember that you can visualize them naked later. I'm like, I said, okay, Mom, but I don't think I'll be doing that, but thank you. So you don't have to worry, I'm not gonna do that this afternoon. But I am gonna talk a lot about things to deal with suicide and loss. I am a psychotherapist. I have been for something like 25 years. And I want to take you on a little bit of a journey that is personal and a little philosophical and a little psychological. I don't know if any of you recognize under the theme Loss and Healing. I'm also on the National Council for the American Foundation for Loss and Healing, which deals with services to suicide survivors. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, when bad things happen to good people. I did not originate that. That's a phrase of a book. That's the title of a book by Harold Kushner. And what he tried to figure out, he lost his son, not to suicide, but an early death. What he tried to figure out is, what is it about the universe or God that allows this kind of suffering to take place? He was a Jewish rabbi, very faithful. He said, what's happening? How do I make sense of this tragedy I go through? So the subtitle of my talk is When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Now, secondly, I want to also introduce you to the concept of synchronicity. Any of you ever heard of the concept of synchronicity? Raise your hand if you have. Great. So there was a Swiss psychologist by the name of Carl Jung, and I'm grossly going to oversimplify what he said. But he proposed that you look at your life a little differently. That suppose there's no accident that you and I are here today. There's no mistake that you and I showed up at the same place. That there was a series of unrelated incidences that if you strung them together later, they would turn out to be a meaningful sense of direction in your life. That you are here for some purpose, perhaps, to take another step further to a better career, a better relationship, a better grasp on your grief and loss, more information on how to deal with someone who's suicidal. Maybe something will come after this. But this is a concept that I looked at when I did a psychological autopsy on the death of my partner. How did the circumstances line up like this, that this occurrence happened at this point in my life. And the title, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, I was a good person. I led a good life. I led an honest life. I had a good job. I was in social services. How come bad things happen to good people? Or do they? So to do this, I have to take you briefly to this gentleman here. On the left, you can see what my partner Troy looked like when I first met him. I was at a party. I was 36. No stranger to grief and loss. I had lost my first partner to HIV and AIDS. I never converted to the virus in spite of participating in everything my friends did, and I lost most of my friends. And I began my work with death and dying. So I was no stranger, but 2 years after my first partner's death, I met this gentleman on the left, also the gentleman on the right. And I thought to myself, I'm in the wisdom of my 36 years old. There were not a lot of people my age out in the bars because most of my generation, at least for gay men, had passed away. So he comes along and I look at him and I say, he says, I'd like to go out with you. And I say, well, that's really nice, but I just want to let you know I'm not dating anybody under 30. How old are you? And he goes, I'll be 30 in 2 weeks. So he began the adventure, an amazing adventure. He had a son that was 11 years old that lived with him full time. I don't know if you can read the word to the left of the motorcycle, but it's what I eventually gave him a nickname called Trouble, because he was one adventure after another. He could build a house from the ground up. He was a software development engineer, extremely smart, was the life of every party, not afraid of motorcycles. Occasionally I got on the back, but not often. I would be the introspective, moody one. He would walk into a room like this and you would want to stand next to him and talk and laugh and connect. And he would create that kind of vibe in a room. I didn't do that. But we joined together, raised his son, and we went on a journey from Laguna Beach, where we met, out to Minnesota, where I'm from originally. We hit that first 40-degree below zero weather, turned the bus around immediately, came back to California. My friends still would say, what in the heck were you thinking going up to Minnesota? I said, I don't know, I forgot, I guess. We went up to Seattle. We both worked with Amazon.com in its infant days. We left the desert and did that. And eventually we ended up back in the desert. And so he would propose one adventure after another. And his son and I would kind of joke about it, especially when at 6 in the morning he would be remodeling something in the house on a Saturday morning. And we'd be like, what the heck's going on with him? He was talented, creative, always busy. So one day he came to me and he said, I want to set up a new business. It was, I think, 2004, 2005. I want to do mortgages. I want to sell mortgages. I said, well, that sounds interesting. I'm glad to hear that. And it was always interesting because there was one adventure after another. But I said, we have a good living. I'm a psychotherapist. You're a software development engineer. Why mortgages? Because I know there's money in mortgages. So this gentleman, when he went after something, he usually got what he wanted. So I gave it a good once over in my logical brain, so it was an emotional decision. And we began a mortgage business in our dining room in our house. This is relevant because it changed our life. We went from a modest income to a very good income, to probably $30,000 to $40,000 a month, or maybe $100,000 between the two of us a year. And we became philanthropic. We worked in the community. We worked really, really hard. We started in our dining room. We opened one office, and then we opened another office. So we had two offices open. We had loan officers, loan processors. Life was good, except for the fact that his son worked for us. That was a little trouble sometimes. But it was a great experience until one day. One day, we were fairly naive because this wasn't our business. I went back and got a real estate license and a broker's license. One day, the banking industry collapsed. I don't know how many of you remember that, but it was one day we went from working with the major banks in Palm Springs, the major developers of a renaissance in Palm Springs. He was so well networked, and I was always the implementation. There was the inspiration and the implementation, that we had this hugely successful business and we're doing really well. That income went to zero immediately, and it stayed at zero. Now, Troy wasn't one to give up, so he would say, don't worry. I was the one panicking and losing more of hair than I had, to explain some of that. But he was the one that would say, don't worry. There's always an answer. There's always a solution. It's right around the corner. He would never speak a negative word about anybody. He would never complain about being depressed up until this point. At some point, the time went on. We dissolved our $200,000 reserve for the business. We liquidated our retirement accounts, and we basically went down to zero with still no income. At this point, I started to think, well, I know I can live in a box. I got this partner. But he stopped talking. And he pretty much stopped processing about anything. And what I didn't recognize was I had 15 years adventure of an extremely bright man that was suffering from bipolar. An undiagnosed, untreated, and he would never disclose it, but I would later put this together. And when that hit, and he lost his financial security, that was a crisis. For me, I figured I could figure out how to survive that. I'd go back to therapy. He'd be a software development engineer. Stop talking. And he turned to me one day and he said, I'm out of here. I'm out of the relationship. I, of course, was furious because I'm a marriage, family, child therapist. I believe in marriage. I believe in relationships. I believe you do everything you can to make a relationship work. There were no other options for me. He's out of here. What I didn't know at the time was he wasn't leaving me. What he said when he left me was, what you don't understand is I'm feeling suicidal. In fact, I'm trying to die by suicide. For me, there was nothing in my repertoire. I was a therapist, but we didn't study back then a lot about suicide. So it didn't even register what he was talking about. I had no idea. I was mainly just dwelling on my bad feelings of grief and loss. And he was, as most suicidal people do, giving me a direct indication of what he was suffering from. We know most people who die by suicide do this, not usually so directly, but I didn't understand. And what he wrote in an email, which I would later discover after his death, was, what you don't understand about why I left is I didn't leave because of you. I left because I needed to have the idea that there was hope, that there was something else out in the world that would give me hope. Suicidal people run out of hope. So I would come to realize that afterwards, and that was of some comfort because, of course, I was like, what's wrong with me? Oops. Let me take you now from June 1991, when we met, to June 11th, 2011. There was one other strange circumstance that might give you some idea of synchronicity. So again, remember I said Troy was the ambitious, positive, optimistic one. I was the moody one, right? So I held on to that anger for quite a while after I left the relationship. And then one New Year's Eve, I think it was probably 2009, I would guess, or 2009, I think. I was working at the hospital, St. Mary Medical Center down in Long Beach, and I was getting ready to leave when a friend jumped in my car. The one thing I'd taken out of our relationship was this beautiful Mercedes-Benz that I struggled to pay off after I left. But it was beautiful. It was a convertible. It was a lovely car. So I was taking my friend home, and he said, no, let's stop and get haircuts. So we stopped and got haircuts. Then I want to go look at this apartment, so we stopped and looked at this apartment. Then eventually I got back to the hospital about 2 o'clock New Year's Eve day. I lived 1.5 miles from the hospital in a beautiful oceanfront condo. The one consolation was I was going to live somewhere where I could look at the water at least. So as I headed 1.5 miles home, I entered an intersection going towards Ocean Boulevard. As I hit the intersection, there was a big building here, I noticed there was a car coming through. And as I got to the middle of the intersection, I realized that car was not going to stop at that red light. That car ended up T-boning me and spinning my car out of the intersection. Now, the good thing about the car is they're built like Sherman tanks, so fortunately I survived. But when the police came and they said, we'd like to take you to the hospital to make sure you're okay, I quickly thought, but I have a party this evening. I can't go to the hospital. I've been to emergency. I know what I'll be doing. I'll be spending the day there. So long story short, I did go up to LA to a party. Now I want you to think about synchronicity. So I went to this party this night, and in that evening, it was a great party. I got ready to leave at 2 o'clock. We were downtown at a club in LA. I had rented a hotel room and taken a cab because I was going to be a responsible individual. As I left the party, I tipped the coat man $20 because I was feeling generous and it was New Year's Eve. I went to the door with my wallet in my hand, and they had a gift bag. I put my wallet down, picked the gift bag up, and walked out. I went to go to catch the cab, and I dug in my pocket for my wallet and noticed it wasn't there. Flipped back around, went inside, where mysteriously my wallet was gone. Now it's New Year's Eve. My friends have departed. I'm in a rental car. I have no way to get back to the hotel. So I go back to the coat man and beg for my $20 back, which was just enough to get back to the hotel. I get back to the hotel and I'm really pretty upset. I'm like, I have no money, I have no wallet, I have no ID, I don't even have my own car. So I decide to drive home at 3 o'clock in the morning. As I drive home, once again, I'm super careful. I get into Long Beach, about 1.5 miles from my home. I go to make a right turn and a car zips up and clips me. And I have my second accident in 2 days. I thought maybe I'd leave one behind in the old new year and why not take it forward. Now I had one in each year. I get out of the car at 3:30 in the morning with no wallet, no ID, and 2 gentlemen who look like they'd beat the crap out of me get out of the other car. And they say, by the way, you're gonna pay for the, and I was like, whatever, here's my insurance, I'll take your insurance. Long story short, finish that transaction, go home, and I'm back in the condo, and it's about 4 in the morning. Now, the reason I share this is because I did something that I had to decide whether I wanted to do. I had to decide if I wanted to hold on to the anger, bitterness, and frustration about ending up single at this point in my life and losing a family connection and losing my house, losing my retirement, losing my financial security. And I'll tell you this, the name of the book, if I ever write it, will be "And Then the Dogs Ran Away." Because right before I left, the dogs ran away. So I had lost everything. And now I'm here at 4 in the morning on New Year's Eve, having gone through 2 accidents with no wallet. And I pick up the phone to dial Troy. He picks up the phone, and I said, "Oh, I'm really surprised you're there." And he says, "Stubborn old man, didn't you know I'd always be here?" So at that moment in time, I let go of the anger, and we developed this amazingly close, tight relationship. We moved from a couple who didn't have to deal with dual incomes, bills, housing, whatever, to a really close family that had separate lives that communicated on a daily basis, at least 2 or 3 times a day. I'd call him on the way to the hospital. He'd call me when he was maybe free at lunch, and I'd call him in the evening. We'd connect and talk about our day. We'd talk about life in general. And we developed this relationship, which we called family. Better than the relationship we had because there weren't many complications because we had separate lives. We didn't have to fight about who was going to do the dishes or how we were going to pay the bills. And it was an amazing opportunity to develop a love with somebody I cared deeply about and somebody who cared about me. And the reality behind that love is I knew that no matter what happened in my life, he would pick up the phone wherever he was. And whatever happened in his life, I would pick up the phone. We made that agreement that if I was in a meeting, I'd jump out and grab it. If he was somewhere, if we could, we'd always be on the other end of the phone. And there was great security in that. And that healed the relationship. And the reason I share that is we were in contact, and he told me one day, and I'm going to get you to June 11th, he told me one day, "I know what I need." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "I need a baby." I said, "You need a baby?" I said, "Now that's a rare occurrence, but it's even a more rare occurrence for a single gay man. I need a baby, okay. Let me think about that one." What he was telling me was, our son was married and had moved out of the house. He needed something to anchor him, to hold on to the fact that he needed to fight through the urge to kill himself. He needed to stay alive, and he had figured out if he had a baby, he would have another 18 years extension on his life. I would figure this out later. So he met somebody, remember, Troy was somebody who could go after what he wanted. He met somebody with a baby, and they got together and he had a baby. He had like a brand new 6-month-old baby that this guy had adopted, and he was in heaven. Pictures of him everywhere with his baby. Unfortunately, that relationship didn't work out. In May of 2011, he separated from that person. It was his birthday, and he lost possession, physical custody of the baby. He basically lost his lifeline to life. Now, if I knew what I knew now, I would have been able to evaluate the risk and know that this is a person who had a history of a suicide attempt. He suffered from bipolar. He was now, in what we just saw earlier, a situation where he lost his second intimate partner relationship. He lost the financial security of that relationship, and he lost his lifeline. That, my friends, was a recipe for suicide. What I didn't know is he was there, but on June 10th, I would go up to Los Angeles about a month after this happened. We were in regular communication, and he would tell me what it was. But what he said to me one day is, I think I figured out how to go on for Trey. Trey was the name of the baby. And I'm like, okay, well, that's good. What he was telling me is, I'm going to kill myself so I can be available to this baby on another level. Again, he was telling me in so many words that he was on his way out. But there was no way for me to read the code, because the unfortunate thing about people who suffer from suicidal ideation is they suffer from the stigma of suicidal ideation, and they can't tell you that for fear that they may be locked up or they may be taken to a hospital. So June 10th rolled around, and I went up for Gay Pride in Los Angeles, a great party, was with a friend of mine, and decided to spend the night. On June 10th, my phone rang, but I didn't get it this time. This time I missed the call because I was at an event with some friends. I picked up the call later, and it was him, and he said, I want to come visit you in LA. When I called him back, he said, never mind, I've changed my mind. I don't want to come to LA. So he was suffering from what we know people who die by suicide do. He was not suffering from the desire to die. He had the ambivalence about how do I stay alive? And he was fighting to figure that out. I would not get those cues. The next day, on June 11th, as I shared earlier, we had this deal we would call. I was preoccupied with another party, so I didn't call Troy in the morning. And the afternoon rolled out, and I went to a party on the top of this great building with about 1,000 people. A wonderful party. It's a warm, sunny day. And as I'm up there, it's about 4:30, 5 o'clock, and I'm getting a little anxious, and I'm thinking, I gotta head out of here. I wanna get on the road. I have to work Monday. I'm gonna call Troy on my way back, and then, we'll talk, catch up, and debrief the weekend. I look across the room of all these people across the roof of this building, and I can find my friends nowhere. At the very instance that I decide to leave and walk around the elevator, they walk around the other side, and they meet me out of nowhere. And they say to me, no, you're not going home, you're gonna come with us, you're gonna follow us, we're gonna go to another club. So I'm delayed from leaving, and it's now 6 o'clock, and I leave the second club. And as I get ready to leave the second club, I've had it, you guys, I gotta get up in the morning, I'm gonna drive back. I go to get to my car, and it was parked in front of a friend's house. He walks out simultaneously as the time I walk around the corner. And he's distraught and upset about something. So I decide to spend some time talking to him, and 6:15 turns into 6:30, and finally about 6:35 I'm getting on the road. Now twice, mysteriously, the universe has lined up to interrupt me from going. As I do get on the road, I'm taking La Cienega to get back down to Long Beach. Finally, I pop the top on the convertible and I call Troy. When I call Troy, he says to me, how was your weekend? And I say, I think I partied a little bit too much. I'm not feeling so good. And he said, yes, I think I've heard that before. Not that that hasn't happened, but someone once said, you should leave that part out. But I say to him, how was your weekend? And he said, I'm not doing so well. He said, I'm not having a good night. I can't really make out what happens next because there's noise in the back on his end, and I can't tell if it's the wind on my end or the noise on his. I do know in the conversation that he starts to slur his words. Now, in the 15 years that I've known him, he's never slurred his words, and he drank a lot of beer. He's Irish. So I try to figure out what's going on, and I remember, all of a sudden, like a movie clicking fast forward in my head, this guy has a history of a suicide attempt. And I say to him, have you done something wrong? Because if you have, you've got to come home. I'll take care of you. I love you. And he says to me, I'm halfway home. At which point he hangs up the phone. And I end up calling several times. He doesn't pick up. And now I'm frantic. I'm in a panic, and I call several times to 911. I get 911, and they quickly tell me, in Los Angeles, you don't dial 911 for Big Bear. He's in Big Bear. I dial 911. I dial 411 to get connected to Big Bear, which I get connected to the fire department. It's now about 7:05, 7:10. And if you watch the clock, I've probably gone 10 minutes without talking to him. It becomes 7:15 when I would finally reach the police, and they would say, don't worry, we'll send somebody out. At 7:20, the phone rings again. I'm almost back to Long Beach, and they say, have you gone out to check on him? I say, what? They say, aren't you gonna check on him? I said, I'm in Long Beach, he's in Big Bear. They said, oh, we'll send someone out. So now it's 7:20, and I'm pretty sure he's in trouble. I'm not sure how much trouble, because it's still not really residing in my brain that I may be dealing with something that's really serious. But by 10 o'clock that evening, I would get a phone call from the police telling me they were there. And I would say in relief, is he okay? And they would say, no, I'm sorry to tell you he committed suicide. Instantaneously, when I heard those words and knew this man was gone and suicide didn't compute, I really just fell to my knees and started sobbing. And I pleaded with the policewoman to tell me that this couldn't be true, that this was the love of my life, this couldn't have happened. And she talks to me about 45 minutes, and she finally says to me, I have to get off the phone, I still have to call his mother. So she said, can you pull it together? And I said, sure. So that was the beginning of the end of the 18 years that I knew him. Everybody take a breath. Blow that out. That's the worst of the story. That's my fat phone. What happens next is a protracted period that changes my life. Well, it began then. The change of my life began because I didn't really have any choice. I was a mental health therapist. I had really been out of practice because I'd been in the mortgage business. I'd gone back into social work. But what I got to experience was these 5 stages. I don't know if you've ever heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It was a book written a long time ago, and the idea was denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. That those of you who go through a loss will experience those at varying degrees. Those of you who go through a traumatic loss, like a suicide or an accident or something that takes a loved one away, will experience those for a protracted period of time. So what happened at that point was I began to track my life in this new way. I remember I woke up the next day after that, after this suicide, and it was really strange. It was a warm day and I felt nothing. None of the horror, none of the sadness. I couldn't feel anything. It felt as if nothing had happened. And I wondered what that was about. What I would later figure out is I had gone into shock. And if there is one stage of grief and loss, this is the favorite. Because in shock, it's like your psyche closes up and indeed you don't feel anything. In fact, you feel slightly disassociated as if you've been moved away from the life that you knew. I often tell people losing someone to suicide is like a tsunami. It comes in with this roar and takes away everything, and you then have to figure out how to rebuild. I then recall this strange feeling of powerless. I had to go through, getting a funeral together. We buried Troy the day before Father's Day because his son didn't want him buried on Father's Day. I felt powerless about life. But you know what? Nothing mattered for a few moments. For a few moments and days, it didn't matter where I was, how much I owed in bills, what work I needed to do, what other issues were going on in my life. There was nothing relevant about life anymore other than this situation. And ultimately, I got this strange sense of powerful because it was this, if any of you have ever seen the movie Fearless with Jeff Bridges, he survives a plane crash. And what happens afterwards is he feels like he's impervious, like he's immortal. So what happened after this experience, I thought, well, man, if I can survive that, there's nothing that can stop me now. And I felt this strange thing like, bring it on, God. I can take on whatever you hand me. Don't ever ask for that, by the way. The next phase was anger. Now, the little point in red, selfish act, was not my sense. I have 4 brothers, and one of them said to me, isn't he an awful person? Wasn't that a selfish thing to him to do? And the only thing I could think of was somebody in that much pain and that ambivalent about trying to survive. God, he did what he thought he had to do to survive. I couldn't be angry about that. I did get angry about the irrelevance of life, about the idea that there was all of this stuff that I had worried about before. There was all of this stuff that bills and finances, losing money, making money, that didn't really mean much when it was comparing to losing a relationship. I had a new sense of the relevance of life and the importance of all of us together and the importance of the people we love and what it's like when we lose them. But it seemed as if nobody had that same relevance. And if you've survived the loss of a loved one, you probably felt the same thing. Because as a therapist, I always thought, you don't have to go through everything to help people with everything. But when you go through something like that, you appreciate pain and loss on a level that you never thought you would experience. And I indeed went through that. I did have the sense of stigma. When I got up to do the eulogy at his funeral, I remember I turned around and it was filled like a room like this. Now remember, I'm the introspective, moody one, so I could maybe get an aisle or two filled. He had the entire church filled. In fact, he had people standing in the line. How could this person who never complained about being angry, upset, never said a negative thing about anybody, how could this person have left? And why was I alone now? Why was I alone at this point in my life where I didn't really, I think I'm going in and out, where I didn't really have any idea on how to act on that? That wasn't anything I had done. Why had this bad thing happen to me? How did I end up here? How did I reflect? I'm a professional, I have a master's degree, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a healthy, functioning human being. How did all of this end up in this situation? And the most importantly, why? Was there something about the universe that night that when it moved through those series of experiences that delayed me, was there something about if I'd gotten on the road at 5 o'clock before he'd entered the garage? There's something about if I had heard him when I picked up the phone when he called the first time. And indeed, what we know about traumatic grief is people that lose somebody to suicide spend an inordinate amount of time on this stage in bargaining. And it's not necessarily that we're trying to figure out what could I have done or if only I had. It's really that we're trying to figure out how to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. A trauma combined with grief is a much more protracted, extended period. And we try to figure out, how did I end up here? Was there something different? Why didn't I pick up the phone when he called the first time? Why didn't I call earlier? And of course, if only I had. And I would later think, was this the universe also lining up an event that I would go through of this nature? Like a bad accident. How did I end up in the intersection at the precise moment that a woman would be coming through a young lady that did not see the red light? How did that happen in a split second? How was I delayed those 2 hours, driving my friend around when I would have normally left at noon and been home? How did that all line up so that evening my wallet got stolen, I had a second accident, and I had a conversation that I would renew the relationship that would I be forever grateful? I would not have had that conversation at 4 in the morning, which went to 5 and then to 6 as the sun came up. Depression. I promise this will get better at the end, so hold on there with me. So the worst of depression is that sort of free-falling feeling. There's a word that I often think called anhedonia. Have any of you ever heard of anhedonia? I always thought that was like a name of a Disney town, and if it was, it would be a Disney town surrounded in a huge shroud and fog, because anhedonia is that awful feeling about major depression, and I had now gone into major depression. Now I knew grief and loss, and I knew major depression. I would go to work every day. I would do my job. I still worked. I would come home, put a box in the microwave that, eat that tasteless food in front of the TV, and lay down on the couch. And then I would struggle to get up to go to bed at about 11 or 12, and I would avoid it because once I got to bed, I would not sleep. There was no way I could get but a couple hours. It was odd to me that no matter how tired you got, you still couldn't sleep. And then things like ice cream. When you're in a bad mood and you pick up that pint of Haagen-Dazs, and in my case, you eat that pint of Haagen-Dazs, and somehow that makes you feel better. Or you have a holiday coming around the corner and you think, that's really cool, I get to take that, or a nice vacation. I had a booked a cruise in August of that year to the Mediterranean, to go around the Mediterranean. And what I thought to myself is, I can't get off the couch. How in the hell am I going to get on a cruise ship? I can't move. And it didn't bring me pleasure. Nothing brought me pleasure. Nothing changed the state of where I was. I was a therapist, so I knew the value of therapy, so I went to see a therapist. He didn't know a lot about grief and loss, nor did he know a lot about suicide, but he helped in a lot of ways. I sought out a group of suicide survivors. I was desperate to get somewhere, because part of the healing when you lose someone to suicide is to be with a community that you never wanted to be with, but you are grateful that you have found. Because people who've lost people to suicide understand that they've been in a place that most everybody has not been. And that when they bond together and they work together and they come together, there's tremendous amount of healing that takes place. But for a good 2 years, it felt sort of like my life had gone gray and lifeless. Now, I did pour a lot of energy into work, and I raised a lot of money for the hospital that year, I'll tell you that. I found a focal point to put that energy. Lastly, I want to talk about acceptance as I bring you around to the end. I always thought acceptance would be that phase in the relationship or the relationship with grief and loss where you'd suddenly say, oh, I accept this, it's all okay, yeah, I get it now, I understand how that worked. Not quite like that. It's 7 years later now, right? What I do know is that evening when I fell to my knees, 2 thoughts went through my mind. The first was, this is too much to bear. The second one was, this is either going to take me down or it's going to make me into the person I am supposed to be. And I am here. So I do remember that out of the darkness, we can find the light, because out of the darkness, we emerge. There was a theory in psychology called self-actualization. Any psychology people in the room? By Maslow. Maslow said, you know, you're going to become who you are. And I'm like, how am I going to become who I am? Am I not already who I am? You know, I didn't get it in grad school. And when they asked me philosophically, how are you going to change and grow in life? I didn't get that pain would be one of my best teachers. That pain would strip away all that adapted, really nice, pleasant, friendly, good guy atmosphere or place that I occupied. It's not that I'm not that, it's that I'm so much more. I'm so much more of a human being today that feels everything. And you know the really wonderful thing, if there's a wonderful thing to be found, if the universe was conspiring like that day, I've learned a new sense of compassion. Because when you suffer like you do, if you've lost somebody tragically to suicide, you understand suffering, and therefore you have compassion for people who suffer. And I had compassion for me. The weird thing was, when I would experience something happy, I would feel so sad and I would start to cry, because I would recognize how far away I was from that experience. I'm not that far away today. The other thing that I learned was that thing about, you know, when bad things happen to good people, that's not really true. We're all good people. I used to sit and watch the news and say, you know, I'm sure they must have done something to get assaulted or in that traffic accident or murdered. They must have done something, right? Because that's why that happened. They didn't do anything, maybe. Or whatever they did to survive. I lost all sense of judgment. And when I went in to do therapy, you could tell me whatever you wanted to tell me, and that wouldn't even remotely enter my mind. I did not have the capacity. Because by the way, when I was coping with grief and loss and doing therapy and taking an antidepressant, I was also trying alternate methods of healing. Drinking, let's see, gambling. How much do I want to tell you here? Spending money, losing money, shopping. Yeah, there was a few other things along there that I'll keep private. I think I told them once to somebody. But you know, it's what people do. It's what we turn to when we don't know any better. When you're going to therapy and you're taking an antidepressant and you still feel that way to some level, what else is going to work here? And I still tried food. I mean, you know, that was really good. Because eventually the Haagen-Dazs did work. But the last thing I learned was about love and self-actualization. I learned how to love people on a level that I never knew that I could. I learned through the love of that man in the 18 years that I got to experience him and the loss of that love, how important it is to love. I can so unconditionally love and grasp the connection to most people, no matter what you do to me. I can still appreciate where you are. So I want to ask you, if the universe is calling you today, if this is really no accident that we're here, if there was a series of events, no matter how bad, how tragic, that some of you have experienced in the room that got you here, is there some resolution? Is the universe working through good and maybe not so good? And most importantly, does it really matter? Because now you have the choice. I made the choice after 2 years of the hospital and sitting on the couch to get off my behind and find out how to go to work in suicide prevention. I went to D.D. Hirsch and I begged them to take me where the Suicide Prevention Center is, and I became the clinical director. Shortly after that, my boss got promoted and I became the director. I was training FBI, SWAT, teachers, parents, students. I was working on groups with attempt survivors. I developed a best practice on how to work with attempt survivors. Because when you get out of the hospital and you're not fixed, somebody needs to take care of you that understands what you're going through. I worked with loss survivors. I still work with loss survivors. I work every Saturday for free for loss survivors. And any of you that can find me that want to come over the hill, please find me. Because I knew there wasn't a resource waiting for us right away. So I chose action based on my consciousness. I have this terrible saying, if you ever came to see me as a therapist, I always say that, and this is you and me, those of you with the consciousness have the responsibility. You can kind of get away with this stuff if you don't know any better, but I have a sense that the universe will kind of punch you around if you don't take responsibility. And you know what happens today? If you'll do me the favor and if you'll answer the calling, and you heard something either earlier from Dr. Casey or from Jeff, or you felt something yesterday or a couple of days ago, or you experienced a tragedy or a loss, is the universe calling for you? And if it is, I want you to think about how you will answer. And I want to tell you that if you answer, it's all there for you. I don't like what it did. I'll never like what it did. I'll never, ever get over that. But as I move further away, I get the rare opportunity when one woman over here thinks of me who's met me and doesn't know where I am, says, would you come speak to our people? Where I sit and I think, now, do I want to give them the statistical charts and the analysis? No, that was the good doctor's job. Am I really brave enough to tell them that story? Is it going to be crushing for them? Is it going to be hopeful? Is it going to be inspirational? Am I going to be able to get through it and tell them? I'm going to make my way through it because it's important. Because what we know today is we have to tell the stories behind the statistics. And if we reach out and do that, we form a community that is safer. We form a community that comes together to heal and that helps people that may still be suffering. And we're all here for that today, no matter where you are or what you're doing. So I'll tell you one last thing, kind of a story here. If you notice the birds, I put those in there intentionally. It wasn't just I was playing with the clip art. Trust me, that was a pain figuring out how to do that. I went back to the hospital one day and I was talking to this woman in marketing and I told her something about the story of my partner. I think I told her just vaguely that he had died. What I didn't tell her was that a week earlier, when I had been walking on the beach, that I'd asked him very directly for a sign. I said, I'm a skeptic. I don't believe therapy works until I'm a therapist for 2 years. I don't know that you can talk to the dead or not, but if they can hear us, I want a sign. At the moment I asked for a sign, this seagull swooped down and started going right next to me and just walked with me, or flew with me, actually. I was doing the walking. So back to the hospital. I'm in this room talking to this marketing woman, and I just told her what happened. I didn't tell her about this experience, but I told her I'd lost my partner. And then I went back to my office. 5 minutes later, the phone rings, and she goes, I really hate to bother you, but I keep hearing, tell him it's the bird. It's the bird. Tell him about the bird. She had no knowledge about that. So somewhere, I think our loved ones are still with us, and we can do the work we want to do. Thank you very much. I think we probably should have let Jeff go last so you could rev up into lunch, but I hope I put you in a contemplative mood. Is there any quick questions, or you want to head out to lunch? Quick questions, thoughts? That's a lot to think about, so take some good deep breaths, relax and refresh and focus on where you are today. And thank you for your kindness and generosity in listening to my story.